Well, welcome to all of you, students here and global viewers, to a new experimental course called Global Sociology Live. We are broadcasting to the world from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and this is an experimental project that we are doing together with the International Sociological Association. This is a course at Berkeley called Global Sociology Live, and I am co-teaching it. My name is Michael Burawoy. I'm co-teaching it with Lali Bebahanyan. Matt, can you? And the cameraman, who I just spoke to, was Matt Claremont, and he'll be with us throughout the semester doing all the photographic work. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this course. It's going to be global in many different ways. First of all, we are going to make what happens in this room, in this seminar, accessible to the world via the Berkeley YouTube, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ISA, International Sociological Association website. So it's going to be globally accessible. Second, we are going to spend our time talking with sociologists from all over the world, sociologists that actually have a global perspective. We will also be talking to sociologists that are located here in Berkeley and in other places in the United States. And we will even be talking to non-sociologists, one or two. So we have this global vision as coming to us by our communication with all sorts of interesting academics and perhaps, who knows, non-academics from different places. That's two ways in which it's global. But its third is that, myself and Lale, we both have had a long interest in global issues. We've done research in different parts of the world. Lale has done research for many years in Egypt and the Middle East and is now studying terrorism, an interesting topic about which she will tell us more later in the semester. And I have done research in Africa, in Soviet Union, and post-Soviet Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, as well as in the United States. So we both have this interest in global issues, and we have spent time in different parts of the world. But it's global also in a fourth way, in that the students here, you, are also very diverse backgrounds. You're all Berkeley sociologists, but as Berkeley sociologists have many different interests and have come from different countries, and I think this will become clear as we develop this discussion. What will happen is every week, every Wednesday, Berkeley time, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we will assemble here and we will have somebody who will be interviewed or will give a lecture for 15 minutes and then will be interrogated by the 30 students who are in this class. And we will do a little bit of preparation beforehand on Monday. So that's the plan for the semester. And the project, I suppose, is one other dimension, one other way in which this is global, is that we're trying to think about what on earth global sociology might mean. We are not very sure. Now, it is my role today to give you an intimation of how I think about it. But a project here is an unfolding project. What could it possibly mean to say that we are engaging in a global sociology? Apart from the fact we have global audiences and global participants and global interests. What is a global sociology? And that is the question we have to ask today. So, let me begin. Now, before we can even ask the question global sociology, we have to ask a prior question, right? And what is the prior question?
What is sociology?
What is sociology? Now, you would think that we would all be clear, we sociologists, what sociology is. Well, what is sociology? Anybody sort of got a sort of simple idea about what sociology is? You've all been doing sociology courses? Well, some of you actually from other departments, but many of you. Any thoughts? Sociology is the study of... has anybody been in my 101 class, 102 class? Sandra, what is sociology for Durkheim? Anybody know? Eric?
Yeah, how the division of labor creates solidarity and therefore creates maybe group
conformity
So
in the
sociology,
society.
it says on the beginning page, is a study of what? Moral facts,
Facts.
moral rules. Well, that's Durkheim. But we, that's Durkheim's writing, the last decade of the 19th century. But we today think probably that sociology is the study of society. Now, the problem is that though we are sociologists, now I really shouldn't say this publicly, but I'm going to, but though we are sociologists, we don't really know what society is. Those economists, they know what the market is, they know what the economy is, and that's why they're so effective in propagating their discipline. But we sociologists are a bit unclear about what society is. So I want to start by saying, well, I'm going to define society in a particular way. I'm going to draw on the ideas of Antonio Gramsci and his conception of civil society. And that's where we will begin our understanding of what sociology is. Antonio Gramsci, writing at the end of writing in prison actually in the 1930s, argues, the Italian Marxist, argues that what is interesting about the development of modern capitalism is the rise of what he calls civil society at the end of the 19th century, basically in Europe, he's saying, in Europe. And what is this civil society that he talks about? Well, it is a set of organizations, associations, movements that exist outside both the state and the economy. And these organizations, such as political parties, education, voluntary associations, autonomous religious associations, charity organizations, these organizations began to emerge, he says, towards the end of the 19th century. And they, he argued, absorbed a lot of and redirected a lot of the descent to capitalism. So he argues that we have a new phenomenon that is neither state nor market, but is outside both, that actually enters into a relationship with state and economy. And that is where we begin. In fact, we can probably represent this pictorially. And Matt, can you follow me to the board? Very good. Okay. The picture that Gramsci presents to us is here is the economy. Here is the state. I always love to represent the state as a triangle. The state, I know, and we're taught, in high school, what are we taught? We're taught that the state has these three branches, right? The
executive,
oh, you already know this pretty well. Yes, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So there are three branches, you might say. But Gramsci says there's something here called civil society. And he's interested, actually, in the relationship between the state and civil society. He's interested in the ways in which struggles develop in the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Struggles develop in civil society and how important they are in actually any project of changing the existing order. So that is the idea of civil society. Now, sociology, this is my claim. Sociology is the study of the world from the standpoint of civil society. So sociology studies the organizations in civil society, trade unions, political parties, even the families sometimes put in the civil society. But it also studies the economy, the market, but from the standpoint of civil society, the consequences of the market for society and how society upholds the market. And sociology also something called political sociology. That is studying the state from the standpoint of civil society. That is to say, what are the social conditions, civil society conditions for an effective state, and how does the state actually shape and reshape civil society? So sociology is the study of the world from the standpoint of civil society. We can say that economics is the study of the world from the standpoint of the economy. And one can say that political science is the study of the world from the standpoint of the state. But we're special. We study the world from the standpoint of civil society. Now, all right, let us get a better sense of this. So what this means is that if there is no civil society, there is no sociology. And it is the case. In Stalinist Soviet Union, there was no sociology to speak of. It was underground. Same in Pinochet's Chile. In dictatorial regimes, where there is a very weak civil society, you do not get a sociology. Gramsci himself said that in the West, and he was thinking there of Europe, but perhaps also the United States, in the West there is an emergent civil society, but in the East, and he was thinking there of Russia, he said that civil society, and I love this, primordial and gelatinous, i.e. was weak and feeble. And so there is a question, is where does civil society exist? Where it is strong, you're likely to get a strong sociology. Where it is weak and fragmented, you're likely to get a weak and fragmented sociology. Now, what's your concept? What sort of things might you imagine goes in civil society? Thinking about the United States today, for example. What sort of things might you think of that goes in civil society?
Labor unions.
Sorry?
Labor unions.
Labor unions. Now, labor unions actually turn out to be on the decline. So in a sense, if it were only labor unions, they will be in trouble, because civil society will indeed be very feeble. We're talking about in the private sector of the economy today, about 9% of the employees are in unions. Perhaps overall it's 12% if you include the public sector. But unions are very, very important in most northern societies. Yes, Lillian?
Religious institutions.
Religious institutions, such as?
Churches. Or
what sort of churches do we think about in the United States of America?
Baptist, Protestant, Catholic, Russian Orthodox.
Russian Orthodox.
Yes.
Very good. A multiplicity. It's a very religious society in the United States of America. Probably one of the most religious societies in the world. So there is a proliferation of such institutions. Yes, Catherine.
You could say like social media and social networking sites are kind of part of this sort of new...
Social media, what are you thinking of? Give me more concrete.
Well, I mean, specifically, like things like Facebook and Twitter. And it's interesting if you look at like what's going on in Egypt right now when there's a threat to the state. They're like cutting off people's access to Facebook and Twitter.
So very good. All right. So here we have sort of electronic media, Facebook, Twitter, are actually become the sort of the new foundations, the new elements of civil society today, and we see how important they are in the ways in which civil society gets organized, and sometimes gets organized in contesting state authority. And we saw the same, by the way, 2 years ago in Iran. Similar story. You know, people's cell phones was the crucial implement, the crucial technology of building civil society. Sandra.
Educational institutions as well, such as universities like this.
Universities and schools. Indeed, indeed. And universities, well, you know, that's an interesting thing. Where do universities lie? Universities like this one, supposedly public, but it becomes more and more private every day. So in a sense, it becomes sort of dissociated increasingly from the state. Yes, very good, very good, very good, very good. Any other favorite? Yes.
Also NGOs.
NGOs, non-governmental organizations. What sort of things are you actually more thinking of?
For example, Amnesty International.
Amnesty International.
Non-governmental, non-profit organizations.
And Amnesty International is very interesting from the point of view of this course because, of course, it stretches, it has global vision, global reach. Yes, indeed. And so human rights organizations.
What about scientific journals like Cell?
Like what, sorry?
Like scientific review journals? Scientific
journals, or actually scientific research, think tanks. Yes, indeed. Indeed, or the media, newspapers, right? It's a more conventional and perhaps a sort of electronic media of supplanting the newspapers, they become a more powerful means of associational life in modern societies. Yeah. So this is the idea. You've got the idea of civil society. It's an interesting question where civil society is stronger and where it's weaker. When I talk about civil society, for example, in Africa, they always raise their eyebrows. Oh, that's a Western concept. That's a Northern concept. And because, you know, in much of Africa, civil society really hardly exists. It's very fragile, very fragmented. And actually, my friends in South Africa, they talk about precarious civil society because it's not enduring. It can quickly sort of disappear or reconstruct itself. It hasn't got perhaps the strength and longevity of civil society in European countries, for example. Ida.
So would you say that the family, for example, is not a part of civil society?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, what to do with the family. Yes. I mean, I think that probably it's variable. And, you know, insofar as fascism had a civil society, it incorporated the family into civil society. In the Soviet Union, one could argue that the family was actually, the participation of the family was elicited by the political party to regulate civil society. What there was of it, very weak and fragile. Yes, that's an interesting question. I think that's, well, Kevin, do you want to help me with the answer?
I said another question.
No. I want to help with this answer. Do you think the family is in civil society? Is there something outside the state economy and civil society? Interesting question. Interesting question. I mean, some people, some theorists, actually have four things. They have the economy, the state, the civil society, and what they call the private sphere. Perhaps that's what we should do. Well, we're not going to. We're hanging on to three. But yes, that's a very interesting question. And one might argue that, in fact, in different societies, it may or may not be. To what extent is it a sort of an element of participation in political, potential participation in political activity? I don't know. Interesting. Yes, Kevin.
Where does the private sector lie in terms of civil society? Because we made the argument for print, like news media and certain media outlets that are private, having a pervasive influence in like the civilian aspect and civilian participation in society. But where do we really draw the line? Because, I mean, for example, you're talking about civil society in Africa, and I mean, if we're going to say that private institutions are part of civil society, then what would you say about foreign corporations acting in
Right, that's right. That's very good. I mean, what do you do with, are corporations part of the economy, or are they part of civil society?
Or both.
Or both.
Where's
and perhaps different aspects of them, right? So perhaps associations like the Chamber of Commerce that defends corporate activities, they may be part of civil society, but the actual corporation itself as an economic entity producing things is part of the economy. But you bring up an important point, both of you bring up an important point, that the boundaries here are very fuzzy and unclear. The boundaries are very fuzzy and unclear. But I will stick to this as an analytical framework from which we can think about what sociology might be. I mean, it's very interesting, actually, this story, Egypt story, right? Egypt and Tunisia. What's the difference, you think, from the standpoint of civil society, between Tunisia and Egypt? You know, we saw, what did we see in Tunisia? We saw a rapid, dismantling of the, not dismantling of the state, but a rapid exodus of the pre-existing political oligarchy. But in Egypt, and this is February the 2nd, by the way, in Egypt, what is happening? There is much more of a continuing struggle because civil society in Egypt is probably a bit stronger than it was in Tunisia and actually leads to a more extended set of struggles. And now today we see actually the civil society is very divided. There are now the emergence of pro-Mubarak groups as opposed and anti-Mubarak groups. Egypt has a much longer tradition and history of a stronger civil society. So that affects the ways in which transformations take place. Good, all right. Yes.
Can I just would like to question this model because I think it's kind of superficial. If you see on where production, like where you produce and where value is created, I think that if you look at civil society, or what you define as civil society, if you take like all the social relations and all which are developed in civil society, which is like the foundation of production and creation of value. So I think it's strange to like put the economic sphere as something like not integrated with civil society, because I think where production and value is created is what you call civil society.
Yeah, well, I don't know I think what I would say is that here, if we have trade unions, if we have religious organizations, if we have Facebook, that is somewhat separate, I'm arguing, because it produces a social life from the economy. But it is true to say that the economy itself has social foundations. If we think of the economy containing, people working in factories, then of course they form a social association in the factories. There are social preconditions of the economy that I would put within the economy that are perhaps connected to civil society. Yes. No.
Well, I think if you look at like a lot of, not at all the majority of work which is done in the world today, but if you look at a lot of the work which is done, which is the creation of ideas, I don't know what you call, like knowledge society, the creation of ideas, the creation of social relationships, both in like in high paid work, but also in like low skilled work, in like when you go into a shop or a McDonald's, then the person who serves you smiles and give you a good give you a good experience. That's the point of it, or the half the point of what you buy as a product. So I just think like social relations and
so
production of society is becoming like what is producing value in society, and therefore the boundaries are blurring. And I think what you refer to here is also like a more old school way of seeing like the Marxist superstructure and basis, and I think that is not what's actually going on in economy today. So I think they're like merging together.
No, that's all right. So the question is, what is the relationship between civil society and the economy? That we have to put them in. And so one way to think about it is that civil society provides the foundations and the necessary conditions for the economy, just as the civil society here does the same for the state. Absolutely. Yeah. So we have to think about not only what the boundaries are, but what is the relationship between them. Yeah. Aaron?
And how do sociologists study communities that have a very weak or lack of civil society? So we can think of indigenous communities or hyper ghettos where the civil society is very weak. How does sociologists study those particular social spaces, and how does sociologists study those spaces without pathologizing those communities as lacking civil society, therefore needing civil society intervention?
Of course, that is a big question. I mean, in a sense, there are nations where, in fact, as I said, civil society is, as Gramsci would say, primordial and gelatinous, very weak. And so there are societies that don't have this sort of organizational foundation. And so how does sociology partake in that? Well, of course, it has to recognize, that these organizations are weak. And the question is precisely, how does one study a massified, atomized world where where these associations are absent? And I think this is a dilemma for sociologists, because their temptation is to pathologize it insofar as one thinks what is normal is the society with civil society. A challenging question indeed, yes. But don't expect me to answer that fully just at this point. But an important issue. Yes, Sandra?
We are saying there's sociology when there is, so if without civil society there wouldn't be sociology, but so you're talking about sociology as the established institutionalized academic science, because you can have sociologists in places where there was an established civil society.
Yes.
Like if we think about the Maya, Aztecas, or Inca empires, there are sociologists that are analyzing society.
So this is another very big question. I mean, are sociologists the people who are certified in a university as sociologists? Or can we say, for example, that journalists who write wonderful sociology are also sociologists? Or can we say, in fact, that participants, organizers, and communities who have a sociological vision of the world, that is a vision that entails the link between the micro and the macro, that links, as T. Wright Mills says, personal troubles to larger processes, public issues. They too are sociologists. So we have to distinguish between those who sort of make their profession to be as sociologists, teach it and research it, and those who make it in a sense part of their sort of life outside the university and communities. Very important issue. Yes. I guess I'm largely talking about sociology as a profession here, but you're absolutely right to point out to the existence of sociologists beyond. Very good. Now, we are limited to 50 minutes, so I'm going to move on. These are great questions. We've got a whole semester to think about them. Now, the question is, okay, fine. I can see there is some squabble about whether this framework is acceptable. Peel is very skeptical, I know. But nevertheless, I'm going to persist. And I said this is very provisional, and perhaps I'll change my mind by the end. But for now, I'm going to persist. And the question then is, where does this civil society come from? Gramsci says it comes. He doesn't tell us where it comes from. And, well, there is an answer. An answer that is given by another great sociologist, economist. I think he's a sociologist, a fellow called Karl Polanyi, Hungarian. And we are reading Karl Polanyi. He wrote the book, The Great Transformation, in 1944. It was a book about the dangers of market fundamentalism, and he thought that market fundamentalism would never come again after the 1920s and 30s because it gave rise to such a terrible reaction and was so destructive. But here we are in the middle of another era of market fundamentalism starting in the 1970s. And we're going to hear about this from Peter Evans, and we're going to hear about it from David Harvey. In fact, it's going to run through the entire semester, I suspect, the ways in which a new era of market fundamentalism has emerged. Now, Polanyi argues that in order for society to survive, it has to react and reshape itself against the market. As the market, and he talks about the commodification of land, labor, and money, as the market invades entities that were never intended to be commodities, as it invades those commodities, as it commodifies labor so that laborers are bought and sold at will by capitalists, so that involves a destruction of society, and society then recoils in defense of itself, what he calls the counter-movement. So in a sense, what he's arguing is that in the 19th century, with the development, particularly after 1830s, with the development of the market, particularly the labor market, but also the market in money, and the market, to some extent, also in land. He has less to say about the latter. He says, essentially, that as the market develops, as market capital develops in the 19th century, there is a reaction from society. In a sense, civil society emerges as a way to contest the expansion of the market. So Polanyi has a theory. Polanyi has a theory of the way in which this civil society, the organizations that Gramsci talks about, the trade unions that defend the working class, religious organizations that build mutual benefit societies, this building of society is a reaction to the expansion of the market economy. Yeah. So that's why we're going to invoke Polanyi as part of this scheme. So Polanyi answers the question, where does society come from? And Gramsci is more interested in the relation between state and civil society. So in a sense, they're very complementary. It turns out that Polanyi is interested in this relation, and Gramsci is interested in this relation. And so together, they form a great pair. And of course, the interesting question is, what's the relation between these two? There was an interesting cartoon recently in the New Yorker, actually. And basically the question by some student was asked, what's the state? And the student asked this one. The teacher says, well, it's the legislature, it's the judiciary, it's the executive. And the student says, well, what about business? The funny point is, of course, that today you would think that business is almost part of the state. There's sort of close collaboration between state and economy. But anyway, that's another fuzzy and interesting question. What is the relationship between our economy and state? Which we will get into. All right. Now, so far we defined sociology And as the taking of the standpoint of civil society. We've talked about where civil society comes from, and sociology is taking that standpoint. Now, we want to move to global sociology. Well, the argument is, I think, quite simple. That economy, in a sense, in this era today, has become globalized in a new sense. Now, what that new sense is something we're going to explore throughout the semester. But there's something that has become, we are using the word globalization. Some people use the word imperialism. We're using this the whole time, internationalization. That the economy, particularly when one focuses on finance, seems to be outside the control of the nation state. And so the economy has gone, in a sense, global in a new way. And the way to contest this new globalized economy, this globalized market, and one can think of course, finance, but one can also think of labor and immigration. The flows of labor have become much more global. One can argue that, therefore, we have to begin to think of what? What sort of civil society?
Global.
A global civil society, a transnational civil society. And, you know, there are embryonic moments of this. One can see, where would you look for? What sort of things might one see in a global civil society? Yelena, you already mentioned one thing, right? NGOs, Amnesty International, human rights organizations that transcend national boundaries. What else? Any ideas?
Well, I guess Facebook, in a sense, the fact that it does touch upon it, like, globally, so it connects people.
Right, and who knows what would be the connections between the Tunisians and the Egyptians. And there is a sort of connection between the two, and how Al Jazeera actually represents these. And so the media has become quite global. And globally owned, but has global effects on creating as an emergent, you might say, civil society, Sandra.
I think this course can also be part of global civil society because we're sharing the knowledge that we have here.
That's right. One could say that this course itself is an element, very tiny but very significant, element on global civil society. You might say that what we're doing is creating sort of almost like a global university through the International Sociological Association. Yeah, very good. Yes, Ida.
When you get sort of movements that go against organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and that we've seen in recent years, these kind of counter movements, you could probably call them, would be part of global civil society.
Right. So there are movements, protests around where World Bank or the WTO would hold its meetings. There you get an assemblage of groups from very different parts of the world. I mean, Seattle in 1999 might be sort of seen to be part of that project. Yes. Jesse.
This is piggybacking off of that same idea, but globally organized events for civil society, like the World Social Forum, it grew out of a response to the WTO, or the World Economic Forum.
Right. So very good. So there is an embryonic, it's not as strong as one might think, but there is an embryonic, emergent, you might say, global civil society. Civil society, for the most part, is confined in national containers, but there are moments when it transcends those national boundaries, and therefore those are the grounds for a global sociology. A global sociology is a sociology built from the perspective of an emergent transnational civil society. Yeah. But that is what global sociology is. It is the emergence. That's why we're having a course on global sociology. It is a response to the new forms of global capitalism that require what Polanyi never thought of, namely a global civil society. It is on the grounds of a global civil society that we may potentially create a global sociology. That's the claim. My claim. We'll see what happens to that claim as the semester unfolds. And therefore, we're going to organize the course accordingly. First, we're going to explore, first Polanyi and then David Harvey. We're going to talk with them about the nature of global capitalism today. And we're going to look at the way global capitalism manifests itself perhaps also in China. And we're going to see perhaps how global capitalism manifests itself in the commodification of nature and the environment. And the second part will be actually to look at the tensions and contradictions that this global capitalism creates around the world, and the way it threatens the very existence of civil society within countries of a local and national character, the way it undermines communities, the way it destroys the environment. And then the third part will be to look at any counter movements that we might see emerging in response to the destructiveness of global capitalism. And we will talk with people who have different views about these processes. So those are the three parts of the course. Yeah, you had a question? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, we were talking about global economy and global civil society, but what about global state? Even though there are, like, there is European Union, for example, but I don't know if that could be equivalent of global economy or global civil society.
Right.
So
very good. Well,
is
right.
a state kind of limited?
Well,
that
one thing is to talk about the European Union. Is that global or is that regional?
Not really, it's regional.
It's regional, so we have to be careful here. Of course, I have not been careful, but we have to be careful distinguishing national, and then regional, and then global. So perhaps an argument can be made that the regional has become increasingly important. And we have sort of regions, we think about, there are attempts to sort of collaborate across Africa. They're not being very successful. It's Latin America not being very successful. The free trade zone of which the United States is trying to organize in the Americas is, in a sense, a regional project. So yes, I think that's one way of thinking about it. But your first question is, what is the state? The state we think of basically as national, nation state. So what is the entity at the global level that corresponds to the state? Jonathan?
Would something like the United Nations be the global state?
Yeah, I think so. We have United Nations, that will be one. As in a sense, it politically organizes relations among nations. Yes, or tries to. Yes. Any other thoughts? Yes?
I'm sorry, but would you say that actually global civil society and global state are responses to global economy?
Yes, one could argue that it is both an emergence of the United Nations, the WTO, the IMF. If these are political organizations, one could see them either as a response to a new global capitalism or an aid, a collaborator with. It's an interesting question. Where you draw the line, again, it's very difficult between the state or the political entity and civil society. Yes, it's a really interesting question. When you move the state to a global level, how to make the distinction between civil society. Is the United Nations civil society, or is it like a state form? Very interesting question. Yes, yes, yes. Anybody who hasn't asked the question? Okay, Kevin.
Well, in a sense also, to go on that idea of the fuzzy boundary, with the expansion of the global market, you have the creation of streamlined intellectual property laws and streamlined free trade laws that kind of begin to create the foundations for civil society, because these countries share these laws and these, rights, And then that also creates the conditions for the UN to enforce, or the IMF and these other institutions that enforce these economic laws.
So, for example, in the area of bankruptcy, there is an attempt to actually consolidate uniform rules around bankruptcy. And there's actually a struggle between the proposals of the UN and the proposals of the WTO. So, to what extent is the law becoming internationalized? Yes, a very interesting question. Yes, Laura.
I'm not exactly sure whether we can actually call these institutions global or international, maybe in their scope, but not as far as the participation of other countries or the power that they may have or the kind of influence. It's more like northern countries in the sense of, developed countries, the ones that have a bigger say, and usually, or in most cases, the only say of what goes on as far as international governance, not only like in the United Nations, but also in international financial institutions.
Very good. But isn't that true of the nation state, too? The nation state has national scope. But does everybody participate equally in the nation state?
It's true, but at least there's a constitution, for instance, when it comes to democratic regimes. But again, the constitutions of these other international, or what you would call international institutions, have a different constitution. Well, it's not really like
entirely true. The WTO has a pretty broad constitution of participation of countries around the world. does not necessarily reflect the interests of those countries, but it has a very broad constitution. And the US has a broad constitution, but still one would argue, no, well, sociologists have argued that in fact there are some people are more important than others when it comes to participation in the state and the manufacture of policies.
I'm
Yes, you
thinking of
disagree?
I'm afraid that anyone would misconstrue what you said, that sociologists just say that there are some people who are more important. A sociologist would say that everyone is at least important in terms of their participation or their say. But I get your point is that maybe the state or the economy and some players care about some people's insight or have more power and be like it that way, and so they are seen as more important. Yeah.
But it's not seen as, I mean, who actually influences what goes on in this society? Who do you think?
The big guys.
Well, who? I mean, Danny?
I think a lot of it has to do with the enforcement of your vision.
Uh-huh.
If economics can enforce their vision, like the World Bank, you can sanction, whereas the UN doesn't really have the power to enforce its recommendations. So they can make recommendations for social development or economic development in other countries, but who's going to follow their recommendations if the nation states don't want to do it, or the elite don't want to do it?
Right. And we'll see when we read David Harvey, he will have a view of which is what Laura's implying, of course, is that the IMF is very much became a projection of, at certain moments in history, of U.S. foreign policy, of U.S. economic policy. Yes.
And going back to Durkheim, the ability to punish. You can punish for breaking rules.
Yes, there's always an interesting question, do rules in a sense sort of represent whose interests do rules represent?
Collective.
I have another question about the framework again, but I was just wondering, earlier you said economic, like people who study economics and people who study political science represent these kind of two different sectors. Would you say sociologists advocate for the extension of civil society or something?
Well, it would make sense, right? That they have an interest in a stable and strong civil society. Yes.
But then we are posed, I feel like we're in the problem of, because of those fuzzy boundaries that everyone brought up, we become advocates for extending the economy and the state and civil society, when in a lot of ways I don't see civil society necessarily as, the boundary isn't just fuzzy to me. I mean, I see them as extensions of these sectors or these
civil society is an extension of the economy and the state.
Yeah, and that's why in Tunisia you can kick out the monarch or the king or whatever, the dictator, and in Egypt it takes forever because there's all these other sectors, or civil society comes in and tells you, well, no, we should wait, or we should chill out on this, it's not a big deal. Like, if we're just patient, then something will happen.
Right.
So it becomes an extension of the state's own and
No,
the economy's own sort of
I think that's right. So I'm making this, and this is an analytical picture, but I think in reality we have to see them indeed as extensions. Gramsci definitely saw the civil society as, in a sense, an extension of the state. We distinguish between public and private, perhaps, but essentially civil society has its own politics, but it's always connected to state politics. And so, yes, I think that the vocabulary of extension is right, particularly in state and civil society, and that was presumably what Pill was arguing about the relation of economy and civil society, too. That civil society is an extension. Perhaps that's a better way of formulating it.
I just don't want to, advocate the extension of the state, for instance, in whatever practice I do, or something, or the economy, really. So, I guess there's a pitfall there, right? Or some kind of trap, I think.
Maybe, yes, maybe. But it's an interesting question whether you can strengthen civil society without strengthening state and economy. In a sense, civil society is sometimes seen to be in opposition to the state and sometimes an extension of the state. And that's the two-faced character of civil society. It's two-faced, it's ambiguous. Yes. Lani, do you want to say something?
I mean, I think that these are all all these points you all are making are really pointing out not just like the blurriness in the boundaries between state and civil society, but also in fact that those boundaries are often the very point of contestation, right? So, I mean, Pila is bringing up all the ways that the economy, in fact, is parasitic upon or comes to increasingly colonize the civil society in our day, right? And Ida, I think your issue of the family actually is a really good example to think about that, right? Because okay, so if family is part of civil society, right, there's also the issue of families are in fact recognized and certified by a state, right, so that certain forms of families are not really recognized as being families. And the very fact that that becomes a point of contestation, right, that in the U.S. at least, that very relationship between state and family is at the heart of what people are where there's an oppositional movement, right? And so I think that we can actually look at those boundaries and those efforts of kind of blurring economy into state as kind of oftentimes the very places where opposition or contestation rises. So that part of the work in civil society is in fact, you know, fighting for a certain level of autonomy of those institutions of civil society, and family being a clear example of that, I think.
Jonathan, you had your hand up?
Oh, I was just going to ask if the economy is an extension of the state, because the economies that are the strongest are usually where like state power is also the strongest. For like,
well, that's it. You know, I think the relation between the economy and the state is not one fixed relationship. It probably varies over time, and states often do what is in the interests of expanding the economy. States sometimes impose restrictions on the economy, so the state will actually impose all sorts of laws on capitalists, saying that the length of the working day is 8 hours. That's what, you know, or that you're supposed to provide a minimum wage for your workers. So the state can also, so that's again a very complicated relationship. On the one hand, the state constrains, but on the other hand, the state will also create all sorts of subsidies for different fractions of the dominant class.
Would U.S. imperialism be more an extension of the U.S. economy or more an extension of the U.S. state?
What do you think?
I would assume the state.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, again, it may be hard to make that distinction, right? If there's a complicated relation between the economy and the state, how can one you can't sort of separate them so neatly? Well, this is, of course, what David Harvey will talk about. You should reserve this question for David Harvey, what he thinks, how he thinks of imperialism as a project of the economy or as a project of the U.S. state. Very interesting question. Ida?
If this is how you define global sociology, is the role of the global sociologist limited to studying sort of global or the emergence of this potential or existing global civil society? Is there nothing else that a global sociologist can study?
No, a global sociologist, first and foremost, would indeed study the emergence of global civil society, but would study everything else from the standpoint of that global civil society. So would study the economy, would study the WTO, would study the IMF, would study climate change from the standpoint of an emergent civil society of a global character. So in a sense, we study global warming from the standpoint of the population across the world. And obviously there will be an uneven consequences for that population. Different countries will, in a sense, be in a different situation vis-a-vis the catastrophes that will follow global warming, if we believe our scientists.
But then we need a very, very wide definition of global civil society.
Yeah.
It has to sort of include national civil society as well.
It has to be national, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. Is global civil society the connection of national civil societies, or is it the transcendence of national civil societies? Indeed. And we can't ignore local civil societies, right? And so we have to build the building blocks of a global civil society must include local and national civil societies. Yeah. And we have to imagine what a global civil society might look like, and from that standpoint think about what exists and also its relationship to economic and political forces. Pia?
I'm just thinking about like where where do we put like classes? Where do we put like upper class, working class, middle class? Because if they are like both in the economy and the state, but they're also like using the civil society as like both a battleground, but also keeping up the powers. And I'm thinking about, if you're saying like that the classes are coming like also from civil society, then the state and the economy become tools to like hold some kind of class hegemony. I'm thinking about like religion here in the U.S. As also being something which is maybe in the civil society, but as I see it being used very much as a tool in, for an example, the state to do different things and to like, yeah.
So, very good, yeah. So the classes, I think, are usually, everybody has different notions of class, but if you define classes in terms of the economy, that we have classes defined by relations to the economy, those who own the means of production, those who are producers, there are middle classes, and they're supervisors, they're purchasing commodities. That's all defined by the economy. But they become organized in civil society, and to some extent in the state. So that is how I would conceive of the way we think about classes, that they become organized through the state, but particularly in civil society. So when we think of the organizations of classes, we find them, trade unions, chambers of commerce, even political parties to some extent, that we find them in civil society. We have to end. One last question. Anybody who hasn't asked one? Anybody? Lana, do you want to have a last
question?
No question. No summary. Say anything you have.
Summary.
Do you want to say anything?
Well, I mean, I think actually, it's really interesting the ways in which Michael has put up this kind of this model for us to work with, and we have so many questions already kind of complicating that, about the boundaries between things, about how things actually work on the ground, about the implications of all of this. So I think it's going to actually be a really exciting semester, because all of these questions we're going to be able to continue to delve into and have different voices come in, or some of whom are probably going to disagree with this and have another picture. But I think, to the extent that we're talking about speaking from the standpoint of a global civil society, that's going to involve a lot of debate from now on, and should be good.
And what will happen, of course, is that this picture will dissolve, or perhaps will be reconstructed. So that's what we have a semester to do. So that's it for today, and we meet again next Wednesday, and we will have David Harvey somewhere in this room with us, probably on some screen. So thank you very much, Matt, and thank you all for coming, and so we will see you Global Sociology Live next week, next Wednesday. Thank you. Bye.